Georges Lhakovsky, The Secret of Life, Cosmic Rays and Vital Radiations, with a preface by Guy Thieu and Etienne Guillet. Hacienda San Jose Vaca, Yucatan, April 20th, 2010. Dear friends, I have recently had the good fortune of discovering the work of Georges Lhakovsky, the scientist who developed a therapeutic method in Paris during the 1920s that began to prove its success by curing and alleviating the pain of many patients, many of whom suffered from cancer. This invaluable work, inexplicably abandoned for decades, remains valid to this day. The most advanced medical practices currently dehumanize us and treat us as fragmented beings. Such cures are based on invasive surgery, radiation and chemotherapy with all their side effects, while Lhakovsky's approach is still current and effective, as well as providing great hope. Not only because it covers every angle to reveal one complete picture, but also because it offers simple cures which are affordable for many people. We are publishing this book online in order to give these findings the wide audience that they deserve. We would like an ever greater number of sick people to find relief through these therapeutic cures. We hope this book will be a big step toward achieving people's genuine well-being by following the charitable approach of the benefactor of humanity, Georges Lhakovsky. Laurent Chabre, Guy Thieu, Prefaciae. I was honored to accept the invitation to write a preface for the online publication of this book, to pay homage to the brilliant pioneer George Lhakovsky and to the man who pointed me towards him, Michael Vladimirovich Skaratin, who had not only known him well but also acknowledged, under the pseudonym of Enel, the work and realizations of Secret of Life. This is also a chance to recall those wonderful moments I shared with Serge Lhakovsky in the Colissa laboratories that he directed in Paris, and our work together in the Orsay faculty under Etienne Guillet from 1975 to 1985. Georges Lhakovsky was born near Minsk in Russia to a family of lawyers and Oriental language teachers. As an alumnus of the Odessa Beaux-Arts and the Arts et Métiers schools and an engineering graduate, he came to France in 1894 to study physics and civil engineering at the Sorbonne. At the same time, he was enrolled at the Paris Faculty of Medicine. After escaping a railroad accident, he designed a step bolt to lock rails safely to sleepers. He also devised a ruler to measure the slope of a railway line and to reduce the time needed to lay down rails by a third. In 1905, he married a young Parisian, and they would have 3 children: Pierre in 1907, Marie in 1909, and Serge in 1913. In 1907, Lhakovsky lost his father. In that same year, he naturalized as a French citizen. After the 1914 to 1918 war, Georges Lhakovsky abandoned his work in industry to devote his time to scientific pursuits, with a constant emphasis on linking science to philosophy for living. He believed in the possibility of creating a science of happiness in society. He took a keen interest in wireless telephony, then in its infancy. He also participated together with transmission specialist General Ferrier, and he formed important relationships with Marconi and D'Arsonval, and the latter would preface his books. He invented the multiple electrode radio lamp, and he took out several patents for refining and improving sound reproductions, earpieces, double-lined loudspeakers filled with a mix of an oil fluid, gums in solutions with glycerin jelly. The resulting sounds did not suffer any impairment and had an acoustic with a richer range in its harmony of frequencies. Lhakovsky drew an analogy between acoustic waves and their harmonics, luminous waves, colors, electromagnetic waves, which, although do not spread within the same media, spread through reflection, refraction, and bear similarities to forces of induction, resonance, and oscillation phenomena. He formed a hypothesis on the chemistry of the living, physical bodies. In their component parts are vibratory supports whose oscillations are animated by radiating vibrating energies. Lhakovsky thought that the living cell is created by integrating the oscillatory phenomena of heat, light, electricity, and magnetism, organic chemical corpuscles responding in varying degrees of manifestations to the laws of exchange and interlinkages, resonances, and inductions existing on Earth, in the solar system and intergalactic space. This is George Lhakovsky's theory on the origin of life. He envisaged a number of beneficial applications for cellular vitality, the stimulation of the human metabolism and agricultural, veterinary and medical adaptations by demonstrating the action of the oscillating circuits or Hertz dipoles of his radiocellular oscillator and later his multiple wave oscillator. The first experiments described in this book were followed up in several countries for cellular multiplication, germination activated from seeds, the growth of the silkworm, the ontogeny of certain amphibians, the metamorphosis of tadpoles, the rejuvenation of thoroughbred stallions, with the finding that horses' blood contained a new diatomic molecule with two parabolas by analyzing the positive rays. These results were discussed in official scientific journals and publications and presented at international congresses, the last of which took place in Vienna in Austria in 1937. In 1931, Cellular Oscillation was published by Doyen in Paris, showing the dozens of experiments that had taken place in France and various other countries by scientific bodies over the course of several years. In 1933, Lisbon Science Academy's Director for Life published a book called Matter that examined Lhakovsky's theory on spatial energy and universion and explained that ethyl alcohol plus formic acetic acid follow a new etherification process called new ondulatory chemical mechanism under the effect of the oscillating circuits. Oscillating circuits cause wines to age and the acidities in oils to lower. Spectrums, capillary constants, and fermentations are influenced by these devices. The type of metal used for the circuit has a significant effect on these phenomena. The results of this research were submitted to Paris Academy of Sciences, London's Royal Society, Berlin's Chemical Society, and Portugal's Academy of Sciences. The author was Antonio de Pereira Forjas, senior professor at the University of Lisbon and director for life of Portugal's Academy of Sciences. In 1939, the chemical engineer Corb submitted a thesis, accepted by his fellow scientists, regarding the application of oscillatory circuits on approximately 120 species of vegetables. But Georges Lhakovsky's most important work centered on the treatment of more serious diseases with his multiple wave oscillator, in use since 1931. Lhakovsky received authorization from the managers of several Parisian hospitals to provide care for a number of cancer sufferers, in some cases achieving unexpected cures from 1931 and 1938. In 1983, the detailed lists of these results were published in Jean-Louis Port's doctoral thesis in medicine at the Pitié-Salpêtrière Faculty of Medicine, under the supervision of its chairman, Professor Roulier. Lhakovsky left in exile for the United States in 1940, following the advice of his friends and contacts in the French government due to his writings against biological racism that was being advocated by the National Socialists in occupied France. Lhakovsky was welcomed in New York by Dr. Disraeli Kobach, who would go on to treat several thousand patients suffering from various diseases using the multiple wave oscillator between 1941 and 1958. George Lhakovsky died on August 31, 1942 at the Adelphi Hospital in Brooklyn after suffering an accident. He was 73 years old. In January 1945, the Lhakovsky Multiples Waves Institute was founded in New York. Its chairman was Disraeli Kobach, MD, who was also editor emeritus of the physical therapy journals. Its deputy chairman was scientist Albert Verley, and Serge Lhakovsky was secretary. During the 1960s, Serge Lhakovsky returned to France and continued work on a modernization of the radiocellular oscillator, a multiple wave oscillator, and in particular the 7-metal oscillating circuit for the Colissa company. In parallel, Joseph Salvat in Béziers worked for 30 years on the 14-metal oscillating circuit until 1963. He isolated 14 frequencies of infinitesimal quanta emission supplied to tissues, and he called his treatment biodynamic therapy. An alumnus of the Paris Polytechnic School, he has achieved remarkable cures for several serious diseases. Many doctors would not hesitate to recommend terminal case patients to him. In Marseille, Edmond Vernet resumed treatments using the multiple wave oscillator from 1955 to 1965 in collaboration with Lhakovsky secretary A. Givlet. After some 15 years, hundreds of multiple wave oscillators were being reused by veterinarians, doctors, and surgeons to treat several diseases, mainly in Austria, Belgium, Canada, Germany, Luxembourg, Monaco, Morocco, the Pacific Islands, the Philippines, Portugal, the Russian Federation, Spain, San Marino, Switzerland, and the United States. In France, Professor Etienne Guillet of the Faculty of Orsay has started re-examining various projects inspired by the ideas of Lhakovsky, Salvat, Vernet. Lhakovsky has handed on to us several works inspired by the universally recognized golden rule of goodwill. Do to others what you would have them do to you. His concept of cellular oscillation is based both on science and metaphysics. He invested his fortune and his time in an attempt to understand the mechanisms of life, its balance, the root of illness. He used his inventions to stimulate the memories of healthy cells, all-powerful cells and multipotential cells, in order to provide organized bodies the means with which to rediscover harmony by reinforcing the cell's vitality. He promoted a way of living and a philosophy that was opposed to totalitarian doctrines, whatever their source or whatever they were, especially if they opposed the freedom of existence in a society-based. Work continues quietly and successfully, taking into account the contributions of quantum physics to biology and cancer research, particularly in regards to research biochemical, biophysical, and morphological changes to cancerous cells. The role of the membrane is defined on the basis of the role of electromagnetism in the organism. Here oppression and informants, or a repressive system that imitated freedom. The multiple wave oscillator is used by various laboratories and qualified practitioners in the countries listed above. The oscillators are assembled, set up, and manufactured in Holland and Switzerland. With this new edition published in Mexico, we hope to help, inform, and motivate new generations of researchers, practitioners in Latin America. Guy Thieu, April 2010. Note on author. Guy Thieu was born on February 8, 1932 in Amiens in France. He graduated from the National School of Cluses as a geophysical engineer. Between 1955 and 1981, he worked on 34 oil and mining research projects with the company Générale de Géophysique for companies' exploration and exploitation of underground energy resources. In this period, he applied magnetic, gravimetric, electrotelluric, seismic, reflective, and refractive technologies. Thieu worked for the Molecular Biology Research Institute for 10 years between 1975 and 1985, together with E. Guillet, J. Copy, Sissouf, Grisford, and various other scientists. There he conducted experiments on the action on the cell of Hertz dipoles, Lhakovsky's radiocellular oscillator, and multiple wave oscillator. Serge Lhakovsky, then director of Colissa France Laboratories, also participated in this work. Guy Thieu was a lecturer on oscillatory circuits in plants at the Higher Institute of Agronomy of the Technical University of Madrid. From 1986 until 2006, he developed and updated the work of Enel, Georges Lhakovsky, and Joseph Salvat of Béziers on the influence that natural geophysical fields have on the living, combined with multi-frequency polymetallic disseminators to return the underlying harmonic metabolic functioning of species. In practice, these studies have achieved remarkable results with plants, animals, and humans to improve their health and giving results that are in harmony with several aspects of living in relation to their respective biological domains. Etienne Guillet. Preface 2. Our current way of thinking essentially consists of transmitting the description of things or events, rather than the things themselves. Civilizations that came before us knew how to transmit the things themselves or their emanations by using symbols one can find in their temples, monuments, and ideograms. Such expressions of the spirit often leave us unmoved. What has become of the senses, other than sight, hearing, taste, and smell, that used to make man feel a part of the universe, in between heaven and earth? The transmission of symbols no longer reaches our hidden or dormant receptors, and most of us are ignorant of this genuine understanding of the universe which brings the cosmos to man's doorstep. Lhakovsky's work, described in this book and particularly apparent in all his subtle and ingenious inventions, places the cosmos within man's reach. The oscillating circuits, the radiocellular oscillator, and the multiple wave oscillator are existing examples of his determination to shed light on man's innermost nature. They were created by their inventor to wake up our dormant senses. This brilliant pioneer of the realities of spiritual world in the third millennium sought to help man regain awareness of his divine nature and raise his eyes to the sun, no longer to be satisfied with prostrating himself and squabbling over material possessions. After reading Georges Lhakovsky, it is impossible to avoid linking together the mass of this carefully gathered and employed evidence with the contents of sacred texts, and especially the book of Genesis. In particular, I think about the relentless clash between the forces of IH and those of Elohim, which is ultimately about the spirit incarnated in man and in every one of us. In this book, we also rediscover the medieval alchemists who used their hermetic science to thoroughly master the constructive opposition of the solve et coagula experiments. I hope that in future years scientists will recognize the genius of this man, whose sole interest was to acquire understanding and to benefit society with the results of his work. Since the Nobel Prize jury awarded Barbara McClintock in 1983 for her discovery of DNA modification in maize, it would seem logical for the world's biologists and doctors to recognize Georges Lhakovsky's unique contribution to the understanding of the energies that animate living matter. This book should be able to help them, as it shows that its author was ahead of his time and that he has clarified scientific disciplines with an eternal light. In our area of specialization on the mechanism of cancer induction, we have often called on George Lhakovsky's discoveries to clarify our thinking and to analyze our results. I shall provide some examples. 1. Vegetable tumors. Since 1925, G. Lhakovsky showed that an oscillating circuit, consisting of a rigid copper tube exposed and coiled in a spiral around pelargonium plants, inhibited the growth of the crown gall tumor induced by the Agrobacterium tumefaciens. The tumor began to grow rapidly without damaging the plant's health. Then the tumor became completely necrotized and detached from the stem. The plant was cured. We have resumed this work on plants that are sensitive and insensitive to the tumorous transformation by the oncogenic bacteria Agrobacterium tumefaciens. We have shown that the oscillating circuit allows for the vibratory energy of the damaged cells not to fall beneath a certain threshold, below which the oncogenic bacteria present in the injury can transmit its plasmid and change the topological order of the DNA. In fact, the oscillating circuit is a mini-cosmos placed at the plant's disposal to bring it back into harmony with its environment. The plant can therefore fight effectively against the stress caused by the injury. The oncogenic agent is always present but is unable to act. Raman laser spectroscopy studies of the oscillating circuit's effect on molecules have revealed that the treatment changes the structure of the various water molecules similarly to homeopathic stimulations. This modifies both the vibratory state of the metallic ions and, of course, all the hydrated colloids. 2. Animal tumors. In plants, there are generally just two stable vibratory levels, but in animals and humans, there are several spheres of energy. These are encased within each other, and they can reach very high levels of vibration. It is difficult to monitor the state and the evolution of the different spheres because multiple controls exist at the organism's various levels. Therefore, the internal spheres can be lowered to the critical threshold level for the induction of cancer, while the peripheral spheres have not yet been affected. So here the proper use of Lhakovsky's equipment is also essential. Thus, we have cured mice with Krebs-ascites tumors with the aid of 64 Cu treatments at 45% power, with the use of the oscillating circuit achieving a complete cure by doubling this percentage. Therefore, we know that the mini-cosmos interacts with the mice's metallic reserves at the level of their metallothionines and with the metal transporters. Since the tumorous cell is not able to increase the vibratory level that it absorbs, the use of a polymetallic oscillating circuit enables it to rediscover that alchemy of life that one could compare with a veritable transmutation of the nucleus of the metal's atom. We are currently working on showing that these same devices are able to correct tumorous deviations with a sufficiently prompt diagnosis. We thank you, Georges Lhakovsky, for your belief in man and your ability to find this dimension beyond the physical body, energy structures of subtle bodies. When the world is capable of fully understanding you, you who were resolutely modern, there will be less misunderstandings, less strife, and less conflict. You are one of those human beings who are recorded in history as indestructible figures in the quest of the golden age of mankind. The universion is your philosopher's stone in the alchemy of life and of the ions in the universe. Etienne Guillet. Note on the author. Etienne Guillet, Doctor of Science and Applied Mathematics, has studied the mechanism of vegetable, animal and human cancer in the Department of Molecular Biology in the Orsay Faculty of Science and at the Curie Institute in Paris. He has taught in Brussels in Belgium and in Cleveland in the United States, as well as at France's National School of Rural, Hydraulic and Forestry Engineering. His original ideas and their practical applications are linked to the global method of systems analysis, associated with a new way of reading genetic information contained within chromosomes, leading to an interpretative energy-related theory on the hereditary quality of cells based on the possibility of the DNA molecule possessing nucleotidal locations for receiving metals, and the property and capacity for the DNA molecule, on the basis of its own vibratory support, to transmit information over distance thanks to its vibratory energy. The work of Etienne Guillet and his team has revealed that metals play a key role in the development of cancer. There are many more metals in cancerous cells and within the DNA of the cancerous cell than in a healthy cell. Guillet and his team have found that by removing metals from cancerous cells, we could dissolve and annihilate such cells. Preface by Professor D'Arsenval. What are you thinking about, Faraday? If I were to tell you, my dear Deville, you might think I was suffering from hallucinations. Such is the legend. More confiding than Faraday, Lhakovsky has told me the gist of his ideas on radiations and their effects on living beings. He thought, and rightly, that his ideas could not shock an experimenter who, for the past 35 years, had studied the effects of the full range of Hertzian waves on animals and microbes. In scientific research, it is advisable to encourage what appears to be the most daring ideas. I have lived in the intimacy of two great men, Claude Bernard and Brown Sequard, who reveled in new ideas, and it did not pay them too badly. The phenomena of resonance have long been familiar to physiologists. We all know the acoustic resonators of the organ of Corti, the optic resonators of the retina since the famous researches of Helmholtz. And still more familiar to us, the biological resonators of Charles Henry Lapicque, Lazarev and myself have invoked on several occasions the phenomena of cellular resonance in order to explain the action of nervous influences or other physical agents in living beings. That space is full of forces which are unknown to us, and that living beings emit radiations or effluvia of which we are not aware, but whose significance has attracted the attention of certain observers, are facts that I have long since accepted. Anything is possible, but one must not accept anything except that which can be experimentally proved. The ideas of an insane person differ from the conceptions of a genius mainly because experiment invalidates the former and confirms the latter. Lhakovsky, encouraged by his own researches and the practical results he has obtained, is particularly anxious that his theories should rouse interest and stimulate experimental work among independent investigators. Lhakovsky's theories constitute what Claude Bernard called working hypotheses. In The Secret of Life, Lhakovsky confines himself to the study of electromagnetic waves, deeply penetrating waves, and unknown waves. There are certainly many more processes of energy transmission besides those revealed to us by Newton and Fresnel. It is in the study of human beings that the chances of discovering such processes are most promising. Therefore, let us experiment by using the methods of physicists and chemists, and let us aim at discovering the special detector mentioned in the conclusion of this work. D'Arsonval. Introduction. I should like to indicate in some way in this introduction the philosophy of my new theory which forms the theme of the present work. What is the use of propounding a new theory of life? From the beginning of the world, have not philosophy and science professed to enlighten us in that respect? What remains of these well-meaning efforts? To the philosopher, and particularly to the metaphysician, I will not attempt to prove the use of a new conception. They know better than I do with what avidity we all welcome the hope of a clearer explanation, the hope of progress in knowledge of the absolute. The craving of the human desire is enough to justify the novelty of a hypothesis. It is the average man, and especially the man of science, that I want to convince. Human knowledge of a positive character is not solely made up, as some would have us believe, of a mass of experimental facts. These facts by themselves are worth nothing without the idea which consolidates, arranges, and classifies them. The future of science lies essentially in its dynamic sense, in the expansion of its fundamental concepts, that is to say, in scientific hypothesis. Every science is an experimental field, whose interrelations with neighboring fields, that is to say with other sciences, are more or less unusual and difficult to interpret. Medicine, biology, the natural sciences are intimately related, and their ramifications extend to the domain of chemistry. On the other hand, they seem to be still separated, sometimes by watertight compartments, from the physical sciences, notably from electricity and radioelectricity. Every progress in the evolution of knowledge shows a new point of view and enables us to explore further the whole field of different sciences, to know their various states of advancement, to observe their mutual relations and the assistance they can render one another. The most recent discoveries in physics have enabled us to reduce to unity the various phenomena susceptible of analysis through the study of all known radiations. This new field is singularly fertile if one bears in mind that all the most recent discoveries in physics, and consequently in the applied sciences, belong to the domain of radiations, ionic, electronic, and atomic, the usual electromagnetic radiations, radioelectricity, wireless telegraphy, and telephony. Up till now, this original conception of radiation, which seems to be the basis of all positive knowledge, has been confined to the realm of the physical sciences, and apart from an incursion into industry, it has not made any important contribution to the natural sciences, whose development appears to be limited to that of organic chemistry. I believe that the time has come to extend the field and the resources of biology by utilizing new instruments based on the latest advance of the physical sciences. My theory of the origin of life, which forms the theme of the present work, stands for this new concept uniting two domains of science hitherto kept apart. Numerous hypotheses, on which I shall not insist, have been advanced to explain the origin of life and various biological phenomena. Let us point out that the most recent of such hypotheses attempt to simplify the problem by reducing these complex phenomena to purely chemical or mechanical phenomena. In view of the unprecedented development of the new discoveries in physics, the latest biological hypotheses appear to be somewhat too simple. Moreover, from the point of view of a higher criterion, they do not give a satisfactory explanation of certain fundamental phenomena, which my theory succeeds in doing. Let us glance at some of those obscure points in biology which we wish to elucidate. Among the most carefully studied facts by naturalists and entomologists, we find all those which are related to the problem of instinct or special sense of animals. In spite of the accumulation of experimental data, accurate and indisputable, no clear explanation has yet been given of instinct. Performance is in perfect harmony with the facts in question, whose hidden significance is also made clear. Similarly, the role of orientation in the flight of birds, the problem of migration, are explicable by the phenomena of autoelectrification in living beings. What then is this universal radiation in living beings? My theory expounds in simple terms its fundamental principles and discloses its nature. In deriving support from the most recent discoveries in the domain of radiations, my theory demonstrates, with the aid of elementary analogies, that the cell-essential organic unit in all living beings is nothing but an electromagnetic resonator, capable of emitting and absorbing radiations of very high frequency. These fundamental principles cover the whole field of biology. What is life? It is the dynamic equilibrium of all cells, the harmony of multiple radiations which react upon one another. What is disease? It is the oscillatory disequilibrium of cells originating from external causes. It is more especially the struggle between microbic radiation and cellular radiation. For the microbe, unicellular organism acts also by virtue of its radiation. If microbic radiation is predominant, disease is the result, and when vital resistance is completely overcome, death occurs. If cellular radiation gains the ascendant, restoration of health follows. The importance of my theory becomes more apparent in view of the confirmation of its validity, as shown by recent experiments on cancerous plants. The recorded cures would seem to give new hope in the treatment of cancer, that terrible disease against which we appear to be struggling in vain. The practical application of my theory, which enables the cells to regain the full vital activity of their radiations, will, in my opinion, give rise to a specific treatment of cancer in particular, and be equally applicable to diseases due to old age in general. Apart from its immediate practical applications, my theory may be said to explain, thanks to the role played by penetrating radiations, the process of the origin of life, the differentiation of cells and of living species, the phenomenon of heredity, in a word, all the great problems whose totality constitutes the biological sciences. I have quite intentionally given a very simple form to the account of my theory, so that it may be understood by all those who have the desire to probe further into the mysteries of science. I have excluded from it any unnecessary phraseology, as well as most of the technical terms that cumber the vocabulary of biology and electricity. The technical terms used in the text of the present work are familiar to all radio listeners. Of such I may single out self-inductance, which characterizes the electromagnetic induction of a circuit, capacity characterizing its electrostatic induction, electric resistance, which signifies opposition of the circuit to the passage of current, wavelength and frequency, which characterize the nature of radiation. Mathematical formula have likewise been omitted. All relevant scientific explanations are given in footnotes. which, however, are not indispensable for understanding the main facts. My only wish is that my work may be understood by all, even by those who are not familiar with scientific literature. I shall be more than gratified if I have succeeded in my attempt. Georges Lhakovsky. When France was invaded by German troops, Lhakovsky, being a prominent anti-Nazi, was forced to leave Paris and escaped to New York, where he died in 1942 at the age of 73. The Secret of Life. Chapter 1: The Problem of Instinct or Special Sense in Animals. General considerations: instinct of orientation, carrier pigeons, nocturnal birds, bats, lemmings, functions of semicircular canals, and of antenna in insects, nocturnal experiments with the great peacock butterfly, diurnal experiments with the oak bombyx, activities of burying beetles. General considerations. The nature of instinct or special sense which naturalists have studied in animals is, without doubt, one of the most puzzling and complex problems confronting the modern physiologist. It reflects, under its most strange and least explored aspect, the whole problem of life. Yet, in spite of great difficulties in the field of observation, accurate data on this subject have been recorded from time to time. In this matter, the experimental method is practically restricted to direct observation, and more often than not laboratory experiments are out of the question. Various hypotheses have been advanced to explain the observed and controlled results, but it would seem that up to the present no general theory has yet been enunciated which would cover all the available data and at the same time give a logical and comprehensive explanation. In this connection, the uninterrupted progress of science is suggestive of certain new ideas which have enabled me to elaborate my theory of the origin of life and of radiation in relation to living beings, forming the subject of the present work, which began to appear from 1923 onwards in various periodicals. The instinct of orientation. At the outset, I devoted my attention to investigating the causes of the ease with which certain animals succeeded in finding their bearings so unerringly during the longest voyages. Such are carrier pigeons, which return to their dovecot after having flown a few hundred miles. Another example is migrating birds, which nigh in a straight line day and night, speeding across the seas towards a definite destination that they cannot possibly perceive, partly because of their limited visual powers, and partly because of the curvature of Cesarta sina lace. They emigrate to feed on insects that they can no longer find in our latitudes at the approach of winter. Some say that this is sheer instinct, while others prefer to call it special sense, but neither term explains the riddle. I hold that in science nothing should be mysterious. Such terms as instinct and special sense merely mask our ignorance, and it should be possible to account for everything. It seems more and more evident, as the following observations make it clear, that the sense of direction originates from special radiations of ultra-short wavelength emitted by the birds and insects themselves. Carrier pigeons. We have all heard of the truly wonderful powers of orientation possessed by carrier pigeons. Although this faculty is innate, it nevertheless requires a certain training before it is fully developed. After the bird has risen in the air and circled round a few times, this faculty of orientation enables it without hesitation, even at night, to fly towards its dovecot, which is sometimes far away. I have noticed the prevalence of this phenomenon and have ventured to give an explanation of it in the present work. All birds about to undertake long migration voyages invariably describe, like carrier pigeons, a series of orbits in the air before starting on their final flight. A most interesting observation made on July 2nd, 1924, at the radio station of Paterna near Valencia came to my notice. A flock of pigeons had just been released near an aerial of this station at the time of transmission. It was there observed that these birds could not manage to find their bearings and kept on flying in a circular fashion, as if completely disorientated. This experiment was repeated several times and always produced the same result, that is to say, the disappearance, or rather a very marked perturbation of the sense of direction in carrier pigeons under the influence of electromagnetic waves. These experiments were taken up again at Paterna, at the radio station of Valencia, under the control of the Spanish military authorities, and also at Kreuznach. These fresh experiments fully confirmed my views concerning the influence of Hertzian waves on the instinct of orientation. A Spanish scientist, M.J. Casamayor, wrote a detailed report on the Paterna experiments. The Spanish carrier pigeon service installed a military carrier pigeon station at Valencia, at a distance of about 8 kilometers from the radio station of Paterna. At the time of the experiment in question, pigeons were released one by one at regular intervals of 3 minutes near the station, while transmission was taking place continuously. It was observed that all the pigeons began to F by circling round for some time, but without succeeding in finding their bearings, as they usually do after having flown round a few times. In spite of a change of wavelength in the course of transmission, no return to the normal condition was observed, and so long as transmission occurred, and it lasted more than half an hour, no pigeon succeeded in flying in a definite direction. It is important to note that barely a few minutes after the transmission was over, the released pigeon flew towards their dovecot without the least hesitation, even those which had taken part in the first experiment. Anno Herreris of experiments which took place on November 7, 1926, in the same locality produced the same result. The original experiments at Paterna put investigators on their mettle, for they could not understand the relation existing between the instinct of pigeons and the transmission and electromagnetic waves. The German Tech. This were written in 1925. Technicians hastened to verify and control Casamayor's observations. In March 1926, they initiated a series of experiments similar to those carried out in Kreuznach. The conditions, however, were different and more rigorous. A site was chosen so that the dovecot and the radio station were diametrically opposed. Consequently, this station was situated exactly as the crow flies on the course that the pigeons were bound to take. On arriving near the radio station, it was noticed that the pigeons changed their flight, were losing their bearings, and appeared to be definitely disorientated. They did not succeed in resuming their course towards the dovecot until their flying had brought them outside the intense electromagnetic field surrounding the aerial of the radio station. It is noteworthy that the simplest explanation of this phenomenon does not seem to have occurred to any of the Spanish, French, and German experimenters, namely that of electromagnetic induction on the pigeons' directive organs. They were all baffled by the significance of the phenomenon, which they attributed to a curious anomaly that they could not explain. Nocturnal birds. The bat. The observations made on carrier pigeons appear to hold good for nocturnal birds also. It seems obvious a priori that the sensibility of these birds to electromagnetic waves in general is different from that of diurnal by virtue of their special adaptation to light or darkness. These two species of birds, however, show a common feature: they feed on the same insects. We are led to believe, as we shall see later, that they are attracted to their prey by radiations emitted by these insects. There is little doubt that daylight has an influence on the propagation of these variations. If sunlight absorbs them, as it does in the case of wireless waves, nocturnal birds should go hunting at night, because their sensibility to reception, so far as these radiations are concerned, is less developed than that of diurnal birds. Conversely, if sunlight increases the amplitude of radiations, as seems to be the case for waves measuring several meters, then it is the excess of intensity of the radiations which would prevent nocturnal birds to go hunting during the day. In this matter of sensibility of reception to special radiations, one is justified in assuming the existence of correlative differences in the organs of sight, as observed in diurnal and nocturnal birds. Among nocturnal birds, let us take the bat as an example. It is commonly believed that it is to the acuity of the senses of hearing and smell that the bat owes its ability of approaching its prey, whose least movements it can detect, thanks to the vibrations of the air reaching its ears. This hypothesis may be admissible under certain conditions, such as the calm atmosphere of the countryside. In Paris, I have often watched bats from my balcony on racing days, amid the uproar of a great crowd and the noise of thousands of cars setting up vibrations in the air, saturated with the products of petrol combustion. Amid this deafening din and vitiated atmosphere, it is neither the sense of smell nor that of hearing that guides the bats straight towards insects, which they catch as easily as in the undisturbed silence of the countryside. The bat is thus most probably attracted to these insects by the radiations they emit, which are not influenced by noise nor by petrol fumes. Lemmings. This is another extraordinary example, the lemming, a kind of field mouse whose habitat is in Scandinavian regions. The famous Swedish naturalist Linnaeus gave an account of their peculiar expeditions. At the approach of severe cold weather, and sometimes without any apparent reason, lemmings leave their natural habitat in the high mountains of Norway in order to make a long voyage towards the sea. Obstructing their passage, such as herbs and roots, nothing diverts them from their route. If a man should come across their path, they run between his legs. If they meet a haystack, they gnaw their way through. If it should be a rock, they go round it in a semicircle and resume their straight course. Should a lake impede their progress, they swim across it in a straight line, whatever its size may be. Is a boat in the way, they climb over it and dive into the water on the other side. A strong current in a river does not stop them, even at the risk of annihilation. 1. Is it possible that these animals are guided in their straight course by their sense of smell or hearing? They perceive smells and noises coming from all directions. Is it not simpler to suggest that these lemmings, although feeding on roots and seeds, and needing an occasional addition of small fishes, travel towards the sea, guided by the radiations emanating from the shoals of fishes upon which they feed? Furthermore, glowworms, microorganisms in decomposing meat, fireflies, etc., emit luminous radiations, and so too with certain animalculae whose presence in innumerable masses makes the sea phosphorescent. It is also common knowledge that certain fishes known as torpedo fishes give off electricity. Thus, an elementary intuitive generalization would seem to establish the fact that certain animals emit radiations which we cannot perceive, but whose effects are far-reaching. Role of semicircular canals in birds and of antennae in insects. Some naturalists have stated that the semicircular canals of the ear, in many species, are endowed with special directing properties. If these organs are removed, the operated birds invariably lose their sense of equilibrium and turn round and round, as though stupefied and. One in his textbook on zoology, Sedgwick wrote, "The Scandinavian lemming migrates in a straight line in enormous herds, crossing all obstacles till it reaches the sea, into which it plunges in the continuance of its wandering, and is drowned." Incapable of taking a definite direction. Assuredly here is an interesting observation. But another observation of the highest importance has been made by scientists. The fluid contained in the semicircular canals would appear to be particularly sensitive to the influence of an electromagnetic field, while the walls of the canals consist of insulating material. Now any wireless transmitter creates a variable electromagnetic field whose action makes itself felt at considerable distances. In view of this fact, we may well ask ourselves whether a great number of living creatures do not obtain their bearings through the agency of waves similar to those transmitted by radio stations. Animals in general, and birds in particular, do not move in a horizontal plane, but in a three-dimensional space, and the semicircular canals have been devised accordingly. The conducting fluid contained in these canals constitutes a directional receiving circuit, completed by an accessory circuit in the form of a pliable spiral. 1, 2, 3. Figure 2. 4 species of insects with characteristic antenna. 1. Nemoptera lusitanica. 2. Uleus melanoptera. 3. Chlorion lobtum. 4. Euchorus purpuratus. In the strange world of insects, many of them possess minute antennae, enabling them to follow their course in a straight line towards relatively distant points. Nature does nothing in vain. These antennae would seem to exist only for the purpose of receiving radiations. The similarity between the antennae of the insects and the areas of radio stations is striking. But this similarity, however, is not as simple as it would appear at first sight. Owing to their relatively considerable dimensions in relation to the emitted radiations, the antennae of insects function in the manner of complex oscillators, vibrating with the frequency of harmonics of a far higher scale than their fundamental wavelength. Nocturnal experiments with the great peacock butterfly. Let us consider by way of example the bombyx in the light of observations made by Faber in his work entitled Mores de Insectis. In the laboratory, soon after the emergence of a female from the chrysalis, Faber observed that, at night, a whole swarm of males invaded the place, which leads us to suppose that this female was endowed with a certain nocturnal capacity. Faber also pointed out the difficulties of access to his laboratory, surrounded by a multitude of trees. In spite of these obstacles, the males always succeeded in reaching the female. The following day, the same phenomenon was observed. It all seemed as if the sense of smell had been guiding the moths. Faber then gives an account of experiments which shatter this hypothesis. In the first place, the moths of this species, known as the great peacock, are well nigh impossible to be found under normal circumstances. Thus, the males must have come from a very distant site. Sound, light, and the sense of smell are out of the question, for the moth makes straight for the cage, in spite of a variety of scents intentionally diffused by the experimenter in order to lead the insects astray. The factor of place memory may be ruled out as irrelevant. Faber also remarked that the moths were traveling in the same direction as the wind. It follows that if they had been guided by the sense of smell, they would have had to soar with the wind in order to catch the scented air. Diurnal experiments with the oak bombyx. In order to ascertain the influence of sunlight, Faber experimented in full daylight by studying the habits of the oak bombyx, whose diurnal activities are more pronounced. Insect like the great peacock is not to be found in the region where Faber was working. How are we to account for the fact that it was able to come from its distant habitat? The males hurried along and found the female locked up in a drawer or rather a framework covered by a cloth, in spite of nauseating effluvia emanating from all sorts of odoriferous substances placed there by the experimenter. According to Faber, the following experiment would seem to confirm the olfactory sense hypothesis. I placed the female in a bell glass and gave her a slender oak twig with withered leaves as a support. The glass was set up on a table facing the open window. On entering the room, the moths could not fail but see the prisoner as she was placed directly in their way. The tray, containing a layer of sand, where the female had passed the preceding morning and night, covered with a piece of wire gauze, was in my way. Without premeditation, I placed it at the other end of the room, on the floor, in a corner where but little light could penetrate, about 10 steps away from the window. The outcome of these preparations completely upset my notions. None of the arriving insects stopped at the bell glass, where the female was plainly to be seen in full daylight. They passed on as though indifferent. Not a glance, nothing to put one on the track. They all flew to the further end of the room into the dark corner where I had placed the tray and the bell glass. They alighted on the wire dome. All the afternoon until sunset, the moths danced about the empty cage, a saraband, which the real presence of the female would normally evoke. Finally they departed, but not all. There were some who would not go, as if held there by some magical force. Truly a strange result. The moths collected where there was apparently nothing. What had deceived them, All the preceding night and all the morning the female had remained under the wire gauze cover, sometimes clinging to the wirework, sometimes resting on the sand in the tray. Whatever she touched, above all, apparently, with her distended abdomen, was impregnated, following a long contact, with certain emanations. This was her lure, her love filter. This it was that revolutionized the insect world. The sand retained these emanations for some time and diffused the effluvia in turn. Thus it is the olfactory sense that guides the moths and warns them far off. The irresistible filter requires time for its elaboration. I imagine it as an exhalation which is gradually given off and saturates whatever is in contact with the motionless body of the female. With these data in hand and unexpected information resulting from them, I varied the experiments, but all pointed in the same direction. In the morning, I placed the female under the wire gauze cover. For support, an oak twig was provided. There, motionless, as if dead, she lay for hours, buried under a cluster of leaves, which would thus become impregnated with her emanations. When the hour of the daily inspection drew near, I removed the twig and put it on a chair not far from the open window. I left the female under the bell glass, plainly exposed on the table in the middle of the room. The moths arrived as usual. They hesitated. They were still searching. Finally, they found something. And what did they find? Just a twig. With their wings rapidly fluttering, they alighted on the foliage, exploring it all over, probing, raising and displacing it until at last the twig fell on the ground. Nevertheless, they continued probing between the leaves. From his experiments, Faber concluded that these moths were endowed with a sense of smell very different from ours and characteristic of their species. Faber's conclusion fails to satisfy me. The act of smelling is dependent on material particles which excite the olfactory sense, but the diffusion of these particles is limited to a short radius in the atmosphere. Thus, it is not due to these particles that the moths were enabled to fly long distances. I thought it fit, therefore, to repeat these experiments. In my view, what attracts the males towards the female in the case of the great peacock and the bombyx is not the splendor of her colored mantle and her velvet wings, nor it is the odoriferous particles. It is rather the infinitesimal particles given off by her ovaries, microorganic cells radiating according to a scale of determined wavelengths and exciting in the males the desire of procreation. This hypothesis is confirmed by the following experiment which I carried out myself. New experiments with the oak bombyx. After the emergence of the female from the chrysalis, a host of males rushed from all directions. After having left during the night this female lying on a leaf of cotton wool, I removed her the following day at noon. Then I placed at a distance of about 5 meters from the female the cotton wool leaf on which the males came to rest again. I repeated this experiment after having this time dipped the cotton wool in a solution of pure alcohol, and I observed that the males stopped coming. The same result was obtained when corrosive sublimate was used instead of alcohol. Now, neither pure alcohol nor corrosive sublimate could have had the least effect on the odoriferous effluvia. On the other hand, these solutions had destroyed by sterilization the living cells, which gave off the radiations that attracted the moths. Burying beetles. The activities of these beetles on the decomposing bodies of dead rats and birds also appear to confirm my theory. As some naturalists have remarked, these insects play a hygienic part in the economy of nature. In fields and woods, they scavenge upon death for the benefit of life. They belong to a certain species of insects which attack dead bodies and devour them until they have restored into the cycle of life this inanimate organic matter. The burying beetle is essentially a grave digger, sometimes traveling long distances to reach the dead bodies of rats and birds, which it buries by degrees into the earth, so that they may ultimately serve as food for its offspring destined to be born on the same site. The extraordinary social life of these beetles might be described at length. Let us confine ourselves to a characteristic which is relevant to our theory, the fact that they know how to direct themselves across great distances towards the dead bodies of rats and birds. Is it likely that they are guided by the sense of smell? If dead bodies give off odors, the odoriferous particles cannot be diffused beyond a range of a few meters. This hypothesis is inadmissible in the case of burying beetles, as in other cases, in view of the great distances that have to be covered. It is also important to observe that the beetles do not appear until 8 to 10 days after the death of birds or rats, when their bodies are in a state of decomposition. It would seem, therefore, that it is the microorganisms arising out of this decomposition and oscillating according to a determined scale of wavelengths, which direct the burying beetles or their offspring towards their food. Chapter 2: Autoelectrification in Living Beings. Electrification by friction of wings in the atmosphere. Influence of electrical capacity in birds. The role of orientation in the flight of birds. Explanation of migration. Extension of principle to wingless animals. Electrification by friction of wings in the atmosphere. Simple experiments have confirmed the following hypothesis that I had previously formulated. Living beings moving in the atmosphere, notably insects and birds, are capable of taking electrical charges, often at a very high potential. In imitating the flight of a bird in order to study the effects produced by the friction of its wings against the air, as for example, by shaking a duck's wing before a radium electrometer after having taken care to insulate myself from the earth by means of 2 ebonite discs of 2 centimeters thickness, I have been able to measure a charge of static electricity of an approximate tension of 600 volts. This tension increases as the earth level becomes further distant from the experimenter. These experiments put an end to all the controversies that have raged for the past 50 years among investigators on the subject of the migration of birds in general and of their direction in relation to that of the wind in particular. It is only fair to state that the majority of observers have admitted that their conclusions were, after all, but approximations, the solution of the problem thus remaining to be found. As I have already stated, all living beings emit radiations, but as far as the reception of these waves is concerned, birds which feed while flying have a far greater capacity and sensibility than animals that are restricted to moving on the Earth's surface. We know that the electric potential of the terrestrial atmosphere increases with height at the rate of 1 volt per cm. Thus, at a height of 1000 meters, there is a potential difference of 1 million volts in relation to the Earth's surface. This increase of potential with height accounts for the formidable charges observed in certain aerial metallic tracks situated in mountainous regions. It also accounts for those luminous brush lights which, in the calmest atmosphere, alpinists have observed being shot off their ice axes at a high altitude, such as the summit of the Wetterhorn in the Bernese Oberland. Moreover, it has been observed that all birds about to undertake a long migration voyage start by rising in the air, then describe a series of numerous orbits before taking their final departure. Why do they fly in this manner? Judging by what we have just learned about the instinct of orientation, we may assume that in describing such orbits the birds avail themselves of a useful process to ascertain the various directions of atmospheric waves by means of their natural radiogonometer, consisting of the semicircular canals. It is highly probable that the purpose of these preliminary maneuvers lies essentially in the necessity imposed on the birds to obtain the indispensable electric tension in order to detect insects or other prey they are searching for, which are actually thousands of miles away. As a case in point, let us suppose that if, to the atmospheric potential generated by altitude, say 50,000 volts for an ordinary flight at a height of 500 meters, we add the potential developed by friction of the bird's wings against the wind, say 25,000 volts, we arrive at a total of 75,000 volts. Influence of electrical capacity in birds. It is worthy of note that electric tension during a bird's flight varies in direct ratio to the resistance of the wind. The stronger the wind, the greater the electric tension acquired by the bird. The weaker the wind, the more this tension diminishes. Again, when the bird flies in a straight line, it encounters on its path winds of variable intensity coming from all directions. This electric tension may thus be regulated by the bird, which simply flies high or low according to the strength and direction of the wind. If, in the course of a flight against the wind, the electric tension should rise from 75,000 volts to 100,000 volts, the bird must come down a distance of 250 meters in order to bring the tension back to the former figure. At this new altitude, the bird will find in the atmosphere an electric tension which, added to that generated by the friction of its wings against the wind, will give it the tension of 75,000 volts, which is both sufficient and necessary for continuing its flight. On the other hand, a higher tension would prove detrimental. 1. Thanks to this means of regulating its electric tension by varying the flying level from the Earth's surface, the bird, together with the underlying soil, constitute an actual air condenser. The bird thus possesses a kind of complete wireless apparatus, since the semicircular canals, in communication with his brain and under the influence of electricity, play the part of receiver. Just as for picking up wireless waves emitted in America, the operator regulates the mechanism of his receiving apparatus by modifying with a variable condenser the capacity of his aerial in relation to the Earth. So the migrating bird regulates his own electrical capacity by flying either high or low. The role of orientation in the flight of birds. A Belgian entomologist, Dr. Quinet, after having made observations for 30 years, states that he has invariably seen birds flying against the wind. The theory that has been put forward in this work provides: 1. It is known that the electric tension of the atmosphere is proportional to the altitude. On the other hand, the electrical capacity of the bird in relation to the soil is, in the first approximation, inversely proportional to the altitude. The result is that the product of these two quantities, which is the electric charge of the bird, is constant. This electric charge appears to be a constant for any given bird. A simple explanation of this phenomenon: when they fly against the wind, birds are compelled, in order to lower their electric tension, to come down to low altitudes, which enables the observer to see them clearly. But when birds fly with the wind, they rise to a considerable altitude, so as to obtain the charge of atmospheric electricity, which is indispensable to them. In this case, the birds remain invisible to the naked eye. This theory also furnishes an explanation of the observations made by Ternier and Mass, Kathleen and Aubert, when they stated having heard and seen migratory birds flying at great heights with the wind or against a light breeze. All these different observations, far from excluding one another, combine to confirm my theory. Explanation of migration. On the subject of migration of birds and the means employed by them to that end, naturalists have advanced a great variety of hypotheses. Some have attributed the migratory instinct to an exceptionally acute sense of sight, while others have imagined the existence of an extremely sensitive hearing, thanks to a kind of microphonic apparatus. There are yet others who have supposed that the birds were endowed with a highly developed olfactory sense, enabling them to detect effluvia which escape us. There are also those who have invoked an electromagnetic action localized in the atmosphere. And lastly, there is the hypothesis of place memory. The majority of observers appear to have preferred the instinct or special sense hypothesis. All these theories do not explain why, for example, the falcon rises facing the wind before pouncing on its prey, which it does not seem to perceive standing close by, nor why sterns and seagulls perform a series of circular maneuvers in the air while facing the wind before alighting to fish in the waves. Nor yet do these theories explain a host of analogous facts. The theory of auto-electrification alone, stating that the bird is able to detect radiations emitted by the living things upon which it feeds, may be said to explain these phenomena that have hitherto remained so mysterious. Extension of the principle to wingless animals. Although animals that live in close contact with the Earth's surface electrify themselves less easily than birds and insects, it is nevertheless a fact that they are endowed with a certain degree of receptivity, which enables them to detect radiations, but only within a very restricted radius. Thus, the horse is capable of finding his way to the stable within a radius of 10 kilometers. The dog detects his master within reasonable distance. Lemmings travel towards the sea from the far distant mountains of Norway. And the same principle applies to all animals possessing a tail, for they all electrify themselves by waving their tail in the air. It should also be noted that the tail of animals producing auto-electrification serves both as an antenna and an aerial. Moreover, the tail is in direct connection with the most important nervous centers. Chapter 3. Universal nature of radiation in living beings. Fundamental principles, nature of radiation in living beings. Glowworm. Fundamental principles. As a result of numerous observations and experiments, I have formulated the following 4 principles. 1. Every living being emits radiations. 1. 2. The great majority of living beings, with very few exceptions, are capable of receiving and of detecting waves. 2. 3. Any flying creature, that is to say, capable of leaving the Earth's surface, possesses a high capacity of wave emission and reception, while animals that are unable to fly have a far lesser capacity in the same direction. 3. 4. The influence of sunlight on the propagation of waves is the determining factor in causing certain birds and insects, whose receptivity is specific, to fly and to feed at night, whereas others whose receptivity is normal function, so to speak, in the daytime. 4. 1. This first principle is the keystone of the theory. Evidence of its validity is given in the following chapters. 2. The second proposition is a natural corollary of the first. The work of physicists on wave propagation has shown that any transmitting system is susceptible of receiving waves and of transmitting them. Indeed, every radiating system can both emit and transmit. 3. The third proposition is of a somewhat intuitive order and is based upon what everyone knows on the propagation of radiations. Absorption of waves is greater in the soil than in the atmosphere. High aerials are better than low ones for emitting and picking up waves. It follows, therefore, that flying creatures are better equipped than non-flying ones for emitting and receiving radiations. 4. The fourth proposition accounts for the differences observed as much in the organs as in the habits of diurnal and nocturnal animals, respectively. All observations on Hertzian waves show the undesirable influence of solar radiation on the propagation of waves, but we are not yet in a position to know definitely to what extent and in what way this influence is exerted on ultra-short waves. As far as waves of several hundred meters are concerned, and also longer waves, sunlight has a very marked weakening effect. As for waves under 100 meters, the reverse effect occurs, complicated by the phenomenon of scintillation. We may now adapt these conclusions to living beings whose radiations are equally influenced by sunlight. As the modern tendency is to reduce all physical phenomena to unity by bringing into play the full range of waves, it is perfectly logical to assume that certain animals act as transmitters and receptors of radiations. It seems almost certain that the majority of insects and birds give off radiations and are also sensitive to the influence of waves, which enable them to find their bearings. In any case, these creatures find their way under the influence of waves, and this orientation is automatic. When, in 1923, I conceived my theory, these principles could only be considered as a possible hypothesis. But as a result of all the observations and experiments I have made, since then this hypothesis seems to me to have gained a greater measure of clearness and validity. Nature of radiation in living beings. In order to understand fully the role and nature of radiations emitted by living beings, it may be instructive to look back and recall the history of the discovery of electromagnetic waves. The existence of these waves was not generally known until an apparatus had been devised to render them perceptible to our senses. The greatest claim to fame on the part of Hertz, Branly, Marconi, and many other technicians and amateurs lies essentially in having invented an apparatus which, independently of all theories on the nature of radiation, makes these waves easily perceptible, even across great distances. The recent discoveries of certain kinds of radiations, wireless waves, X-rays, radioactivity, cosmic rays, have but slightly lifted the veil of mystery concealing from our senses whole gamuts of waves which elude direct perception. Is it not possible that we are surrounded by other radiations imperceptible to us because we do not possess the necessary apparatus capable of revealing them to our senses? If we admit that birds emit and detect radiations imperceptible to us, the terms instinct and special sense employed to explain certain characteristics become clear. Immediately, and assume a precise significance. The sense of orientation in birds and in animals generally explains itself at once. Just as a ship lost in a fog tries to ascertain by means of a radiogoniometric apparatus the direction of the Hertzian beacon sending off electromagnetic waves, so too, the animals and insects in question try to pick up radiations emitted by living beings and plants which have a definite interest for them. Their orientation is subsequently determined by the bearings obtained. But it may be objected that space would then be riddled with innumerable radiations. How would it be possible for these creatures to detect them? The answer is simple. Discrimination is easily effected thanks to the diversity of frequencies which characterizes these radiations. We shall see how this is accomplished presently. What is the organ which enables an animal to pick up these waves and to detect them while also rendering them perceptible to their senses? My firm conviction is that this organ is the semicircular canals of the ear, whose fluid is sensitive to electromagnetic fields, thus enabling animals to be aware of the vibrations they are searching for. We may now examine more closely the functions of the semicircular canals by studying the modalities of their configuration in different living species. The invertebrates do not possess any semicircular canals, but only membranous vesicles which take their place and have similar functions. Yves Delage mentions the case of the octopus, which is still able to swim after being blinded, but turns round its longitudinal axis or plane of symmetry when the vesicles which can control its faculty of orientation have been destroyed. After the destruction of both labyrinths, aquatic animals and notably frogs can no longer swim nor jump in a straight line. It should also be noted that lampreys, which have only 2 pairs of canals, can only move in space in 2 directions, that Japanese mice, which only possess the superior vertical canals, can move only in one direction, right or left, and are moreover incapable of moving straight ahead or in a vertical direction. These rodents, as Edison has shown, know only one space of 1 dimension. The majority of the vertebrates possess semicircular canals arranged in 3 planes in space. This assemblage of 3 canals, each of which is at right angles to the other 2, constitutes the labyrinth, which is completed by more or less developed organs, the vestibule and the cochlea. 1. Now, whereas the cochlea is highly developed in mammals, it is practically absent in fishes, reptiles, and birds. How may we account for this difference? Is the presence of the cochlea in mammals related to a special sense which is absent in birds and fishes? I believe that, from the point of view of my theory, the question is susceptible of a very simple and general explanation. We have already seen that the semicircular canals function as a radiogoniometric system whose orientation depends on the direction of the particular waves picked up. As far as fishes and birds which move in 3-dimensional space are concerned, this picking up process is facilitated, as we have pointed out before, by autoelectrification effected either by means of variations of altitude within the terrestrial electric field, regulated by the birds themselves, or else by means of friction of living bodies resulting from contact with air or water. Mammals not endowed with such powers and confined to moving in a two-dimensional space represented by the Earth's surface need an auxiliary organ to pick up the particular waves that sensitize their radiogoniometric canals. This is where the cochlea plays an important part as a kind of aerial left open and wound up in the form. One in physiology, the labyrinth is a name given to the series of cavities of the internal ear. It comprises the vestibule, cochlea, and semicircular canals. The vestibule is an oval cavity of the internal ear which forms the entrance of the cochlea. The cochlea is a cavity of the internal ear resembling a snail shell. Helmholtz was of the opinion that it served the purpose of analyzing sound waves of and more or less flattened tube filled with a conducting fluid. The question now arises, what about the reptiles? In spite of their incapacity to scale heights or fathom depths, why are they not brought in the same category as mammals, and why are they devoid of a cochlea? Figure 3. Diagram of semicircular canals in different species of vertebrates. A. Fishes, B. Birds and reptiles, C. Mammals. It should be noted that apart from the three semicircular canals being disposed at right angles to one another, these organs are differentiated by features corresponding to the particular needs of each species. Fishes obtain the necessary electric tension by friction resulting from the impact of their bodies against water and by swimming nearer to or further from the Earth's level. Similarly, birds acquire autoelectrification by friction of wings against the air and by varying the altitude in the course of their flight. Mammals which cannot avail themselves of either of these autoelectrification processes are in need, in order to pick up waves, of a special directing apparatus represented by the accessory spiral M. The answer will be apparent to anyone who has observed the movements of reptiles. If, by chance, on a warm summer's day, you have the opportunity of seeing an adder, for example, you may observe that while resting, its long articulated body is arranged somewhat in the form of a flattened coil. This state of apparent repose or sleep, which the snake seems to have assumed, is in reality a state of subconscious watching. The adder watches. The harmonious winding of its body is a small receiving apparatus, which to a great extent makes up for the absence of a diminutive cochlea in the labyrinth containing the semicircular canals. If an owl or any other diurnal bird of prey should venture to approach the snake, or if a harmless green frog, an easy prey, should go near it, this improvised receiving apparatus, formed by the adder's body, will immediately warn the snake, which will be prepared either for attack or for escape. This would seem to prove the needlessness of a specific spiral apparatus for picking up waves. Thus, once again, we have a confirmation of the ancient dictum, nature does nothing in vain, and there is no reason why a useless organ should be preserved when nature finds a better substitute for it. What then are these radiations emitted by living beings? Like all other known radiations, they are characterized by their wavelength. Our present task is to consider the range of wavelengths that comprises these radiations. The glowworm. At the outset, let us show by a concrete example that it would be absurd to deny the principle that living beings emit radiations. This negation is obviously futile, as all available data formally contradict it. No great mental effort is required to think of an insect which emits luminous radiations. I mean the glowworm. What is the glowworm? An insect that remains more or less constantly in a luminous state. Experiments have shown by direct observation that the eggs of the glowworm are spontaneously luminous, and that this characteristic light is transmitted without a break from generation to generation. What then is this radiation of the glowworm? Nothing but radiations of ordinary light, but filtered and giving a special luminous spectrum that may be observed with the spectroscope. Hence, if we perceive the luminescence of the glowworm, It is primarily because it is due to a luminous radiation emanating from cells, certain molecules of which vibrate with the same frequency as light, which we can perceive immediately because it affects our visual sense. Why then should we admit the possibility of the glowworm emitting luminous radiations while refusing to admit the possibility of other insects emitting different types of radiations beyond the range of luminous ones, and consequently imperceptible to our senses? Such an attitude is reminiscent of the skeptical Thomas, for we insist on seeing the radiations before believing in their existence. But we know that in the incommensurable range of vibrations, only the luminous octave is visible to us. There is no gainsaying this, and the mystery of the cases under consideration vanishes if we admit that the fact of emitting radiations is a universal property of living matter, just as it is becoming more and more evident that radioactivity is a universal property of inanimate matter. We may ask ourselves whence comes the energy necessary for radiation. We shall see later how this question may be answered in its generalized form, and also in regard to all living beings. In any case, it seems inconsistent not to concede to other living beings what is conceded in the particular case of the glowworm. The full range of radiating properties of living beings does not manifest itself to our senses any more than the complete gamut of electromagnetic waves. Let us humbly remind ourselves that the human body has but very small windows looking out upon the incommensurable range of an ocean of radiations. Our senses can reveal to us but a few octaves. The scanty knowledge we have concerning radiations of living beings must suffice to guide us in the study of the whole range. We have drawn attention to the luminescence of the glowworm which emits a cold light, or nearly so. It is hardly necessary to add that all animals with a constant normal temperature, or a temperature higher than that of the ambient atmosphere, emit calorific radiations, IOM radiations. Before formulating a general theory and dealing with the problem of energy, let us say a few words on radiations in general, and especially on electromagnetic radiations with which modern science has made us familiar. These radiations constitute the basis of the most important phenomena in physics. The propagation of sound waves through matter is effected against a certain amount of resistance, while electromagnetic waves traverse the most tenuous space filled only by the all-pervading ether. Among such waves, we find wireless waves, calorific waves, luminous waves, actinic waves, X-rays, and penetrating waves. Chapter 4. On radiations in general and on electromagnetic waves in particular. Nature and characteristics of known radiations. Table of radiations, electromagnetic waves, role of self-induction and capacity, the oscillating circuit, natural period and resonance. Explanatory analogies concerning electrical oscillations, ultra-short waves. Nature and characteristics of known radiations. It is generally known that a radiation is a disturbance of the ether traveling at the velocity of light, that is to say 186,326 cm less per second. The range of known radiations comprises wireless waves, calorific, luminous, chemical radiations, X-rays, gamma rays of radium, and cosmic rays. These various radiations differ from one another only by their frequency, that is to say by the number of oscillations per second which characterizes them. The wavelength is the distance covered by the wave per second in the course of its propagation. The higher the frequency of radiation, the shorter is its wavelength. The process of radiation does not involve transport of matter or emission of particles. It is essentially the propagation of a disturbance occurring in the ether. Such are the main principles of the theory of radiations governing modern physics. The table on page 62 represents the complete scale of electromagnetic waves with their respective wavelength and frequency. According to Clerk Maxwell, who conceived a famous theory of light, luminous radiation is of a purely electromagnetic nature. As electromagnetic waves are now familiar to all, we propose considering them at some length. This apparent digression is necessary in order to get a clear grasp of the technical details that will be given later in connection with my theory of radiation of cells. A result of its rotatory motion, the Earth thus played a part, at the end of 24 hours, or even after a few days, in the formation of a filament no longer rectilinear but curved, and at times having the shape of a tangled cluster. The new parts of this filament were consequently formed along the line of magnetic force, invariable in direction, while the parts already formed were swept along by the motion of the Earth. As this conducting filament was being formed, the insulating sheath or membrane enveloping it continued to grow and to consolidate itself at the same time as the filament. This kind of phenomenon took place in a microscopic globule of vapor measuring 3 microns in diameter. It is this insulating membrane which, once the circuit was completed, finally prevented the extremities of filament from being joined together and even from coming into contact with the internal conducting medium. The filament, that is to say the nucleus of the cell, was thus finally formed. The formation of this cellular circuit was due short to the presence of lines of force arising out of celestial space and its configuration to the rotation of the Earth. The circuit thus formed was endowed by construction with capacity and self-inductance. It then immediately began to vibrate under the influence of electromagnetic radiations and penetrating rays, among which a certain frequency equivalent to the frequency of the circuit was found with which it could vibrate in resonance. This microscopic globule of mineralized water, already showing signs of organization, was then completed chemically by its other organic structures, such as protoplasm, cytoplasm, micelle, vacuoles, etc., always by aggregation of molecules, and as it was vibrating and radiating, this globule was living and the cell was born.